if you do decide to regulate, and you regulate in a way that allows for a high price, firms still really don't have any incentive to really reduce their costs any more than they absolutely have to. Okay, third thing you can do is public ownership, right? So the idea is that you say, you know what, you're going to be a monopoly, but we, the government, will own you. Okay, this is the case with some utilities, that's true, which also gets you into regulation, all right, kind of some overlap. But now and again, you don't see it much in this country, and you sure as heck really don't see it at the federal level. But every now and again, you'll see the federal government or the state governments actually own something. You just don't see it. Now, again, at the local level, you see this a little bit with utilities. You see a lot of it with utilities. And at the federal government level, it's really the United States Postal Service. Okay? It's just not something that we do. Okay. Now, with that said, again, if it's public ownership, you're assuming that the government will act in a way that will make sure that consumers are taken care of, right? That the prices aren't so high that it would be considered gouging. You would also assume that government would also try to keep things efficient. Now, that's been one of the knocks on government. The government isn't always efficient, and they don't wish to be efficient, right? That, you know, if you think about even with your workforce, it's very, very difficult to get rid of government workers once you've hired them. Whereas in the private sector, it's incredibly easy, absent of any explicit employment contract. Okay, the last thing you can do is just basically do nothing, all right? And the hope of doing nothing is that either A, this monopoly will become benevolent and really take care of consumers by lowering prices when they know they could charge something a little bit higher. And then, of course, also, now I've erased it, but also making sure quantity is where something more reasonable to it, and, you know, close to C, you know, where marginal cost hits the demand curve. Where output is reasonable and can meet consumer demand. Again, even if you do nothing, you hope that other competitors at some point in time would become so innovative and have such new ideas, perhaps maybe protected by intellectual property, that they're able to get into the market. Remember the one thing that we started with when we looked at monopolies, right, for the first time. Monopolies generally get there for no other reason they can lower their costs, right? Remember we talked about the uneven cost structures reality. But let's say we get a firm that's very innovative, wishes to compete at some level, all right? Maybe they've got a new patent, a new process, something that's going to be a game changer. Now, if you do nothing, maybe you wait around long enough, you'll have something new. You know, a classic example of that would be basically transportation. You think of what Uber and Lyft have been able to do, right? They've really been able to undercut cabs. Now, in most cities, whether it be Akron, Canton, Cleveland, and especially New York, where, you know, literally there were no private cab companies, the city owned everything. But even in this neck of the woods where there just were few cab companies, it was really impossible to have any type of competition. But along comes Uber and Lyft, and now, of course, you know, if you've ever used Uber and Lyft, you certainly make the argument it's faster, it's cheaper, and it's cleaner. I'm not trying to sully cab companies or anything like that, but if you travel enough and use transportation, you can certainly argue those three things. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to change gears a little bit, all right? And I'm just going to kind of put something on the board here, all right? Let's go with a little bit of blue here. All right, let's look at two ends of the spectrum, all right? And say this is a monopoly, all right? And we'll say over here this is... We'll say this is perfect. Competition, right? Okay, so let's just say these are two extremes, right? What we're going to do is we're going to look at two other things. Admittedly, one we're going to look at a little bit more than the other. Okay, but we're going to look at oligopolies and monopolistic competition. So let's go ahead and put those in our, let me get a little bookend there, anchor. All right, let's plug those in. if we had to, I would put an oligopoly there, and maybe towards kind of the middle. And the oligopoly isn't going to be in the middle. They're between these two extremes. But I'm going to put it, let me drop it down a little bit here. Okay, whoops. That's an N. Okay, I'm going to put it somewhere kind of in the middle. And this kind of gives it away maybe a little bit. We're going to spend more time talking about monopolistic competition than we are the oligopoly. Now, oligopoly. All right, now, here's why we're going to spend time talking about this. You know, in economics, and this is actually true in law too, we wind up looking at the extremes, right, to kind of paint the picture, get a framework in mind. But in reality, that's pretty rare, and that's pretty rare, and most things are probably here or maybe a little bit over here, all right? So that's why we're going to spend a little bit more time talking. We're going to introduce the oligopoly here in a second, but we're going to spend more time talking about monopolistic competition. It just makes a little bit more sense to do so. Okay, so but let's kind of set things up where we are right now. Okay, for the most part in a competitive firm, right, everything's at marginal cost. Marginal cost is marginal revenue is price. Everything is, you know, we'll go ahead and I'll tell you what, let me get rid of this and we'll just, all right, so we'll use a little maroon here, all right. If we're in a competitive market, we know this, right? Price takers, right? Nobody really has a whole lot of control, all right? Also in a competitive market, right? There's zero economic profit. Okay, we know that. Okay, now, let me, let's divide them by brown here. Okay, so this is a competitive market. Okay, oh, let's use a little red here. All right, now, if you're a monopoly, you're at least at the following, right? Okay, you know you're at least there, right? That makes sense, okay? And I'm just, since we don't have an exact figure, you know, you're going to have some economic profit, right? It's going to be positive, right? Unless you're really just designed to run the place right into the ground, okay? Now, again, if up here in maroon, right? Competitive market, down here in red, this is a monopolistic condition, a monopoly firm, M firm if you will. We're going to use MC firm here in a little bit for monopolistic competition in that firm in that kind of world. Okay, if that's the case, right, and this is the dichotomy, we're going to talk about something that's kind of in the middle, okay? Now, the other thing about, this is just kind of a reminder, with a competitive market, all right, firms in a competitive market, they're selling the same thing, right? Monopolistic, remember they're the only game in town. They're it. That's the only positive, I keep saying that as a phrase like they're the only game in town, but they're the only firm that offers this type of good or service, right? Could be the country or the entire world. Okay, now, with that said, all right, and that kind of fresh in your mind, all right, what I'm going to do briefly, and like I said, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time looking at it, all right, is I'm going to briefly introduce the oligopoly, okay, and we're going to spend a little bit of time with it here. We'll come back to it for just a little bit later in the outline, but we're just not going to spend a whole lot of time with it. Okay, now an oligopoly is where we have a few firms, like a handful of firms, all right, offering the same good. So where it's a monopoly and it's just one firm, maybe we've got a few, okay? And essentially, the way in which we determine whether we have an oligopic condition, all right, is that, try this again. one more time. Let's see what we use a concentration ratio. And the question becomes whether 4 or fewer firms collectively have greater than 50% of the market. All right. Now, by the way, it's 4 or fewer firms, but at least 2, right? So it's basically 2, 3, or 4. Okay, let me get to the page that I want to be on. Okay, now, when you think about oligopolies, frankly, they're pretty rare. They either wind up in a monopoly or a monopolistic competition, so they're not around very long. But we can give you a great example, all right? Large aircraft manufacturing, all right? There are 2 firms that really build large commercial aircraft in this world, if you will, and that's Boeing and Airbus. Okay, Bombardier maybe, Embraer maybe, but for the most part, it's really those 2 big firms, Boeing and Airbus, and they're constantly going after each other all the time. Okay. But again, the oligopolies really don't. But we determine whether we use this concentration ratio, and we just determine whether it's 4 or fewer firms, but at least 2. All right. So 2, 3, or 4 firms have greater than 50%. And the the large aircraft manufacturing industry is probably the best example there. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do now is we'll stop there, and we will pick up with monopolistic competition again. We'll spend much more time there. We'll return to the oligopoly just for a little bit, but we'll spend much time there. All right. See you soon.